once again, thank you so much for organizing this conference. You know, since the beginning of the day, the speakers have been thanking me, but I'm the one who should be thanking you, both for the invitation and the great conference. I really enjoyed the papers. And those of you who attended the conference know that the last paper, but also some other papers presented earlier, touched on the issue of informality, which is the main theme of my two lectures. So today I will continue I will continue talking on this topic. What I'm going to talk about today regards the relationship between trade and informality. And my talk is going to be based on some joint work that I've done with Rafael Di Carneiro, Costas Meir, who is here, and also Gabriel Ulyssea, who's an expert in informality. So let me start with a brief review of the issues I talked about yesterday, just to remind you what the issues are. So I made a point yesterday that informality is a major feature of labor markets in developing countries. It represents a substantial share of firms, but also a substantial share of the labor force in almost all developing countries, and especially in Latin America. So today I'm going to focus on Brazil. In Latin America, the numbers that you see in the literature range from 35% in Chile to 80% in Peru. Brazil is somewhere in between. And again, to remind you, informality, broadly speaking, reflects an attempt to bypass very costly regulations, taxes, and other bureaucratic complications that formal firms, these are firms that are registered with the authorities, face. In general, informal jobs are considered to be low quality, and as I said yesterday, informality is considered to be anathema to development. So most policymakers in developing countries try to contain informality. At the same time, in the trade literature, there have been several papers recently that make the point that shifts into and out of informality are potentially important margins of adjustment when an economy is faced with trade liberalization. So some of the papers I mentioned yesterday were McCaig and Pouchning, who show a dramatic decrease in informality actually for the case of Vietnam. Then there is Di Carneiro and Kovac, who showed an increase in informality in response to the trade liberalization in Brazil, and they actually argued that this increase in informality acted as an employment buffer, so the informal sector absorbed trade displaced workers. Following up on the same thing, Pouchning and Ulyssea showed that in those regions where enforcement was stricter, the non-employment went up by more. So again, all these papers suggest that it is likely that the informal sector plays this role of an employment buffer. All this work that I talked about was based on diff in diffs, with all the pros and cons of this research design. On one hand, the empirical results are credible, they're well identified. On the other hand, these are all relative effects, so we cannot really say anything about the aggregate effects for the economy, and also they don't permit more general welfare statements. So the work that I started with Costas and Gabriel and Rafael attempts to improve on these dimensions, okay? So to take into account all these issues that I talked about yesterday and try to provide an integrated framework for thinking about these issues. So let me add, so as I said, I'm going to focus specifically on the relationship between trade and informality. And I'm going to do it for two reasons. So one is that there has been this expectation in the literature that as economies open up to trade, as they become more open, and as they grow as a result, informality would automatically go down. And as I showed you yesterday, this expectation is not confirmed by the data. If you look at aggregate data across the world, informality has stayed pretty much stable. So I was talking to Richard earlier today in the UK, actually. If you look at self-employment, not informal employment the way we understand it in Brazil, but self-employment, this has actually gone up in recent years. So at any rate, this expectation is not confirmed, so this is an interesting question. How does openness interact with informality? Another issue is that all the results we have in international trade, or the predictions of trade models, are based on work that focuses on the formal sector alone. And again, for those of you who are trade economists, as you probably all know, trade is, concerns transactions between large firms. I mean, Kalina's data in the paper she presented yesterday show that very clearly when it comes to Chinese firms. It's a few very large Chinese firms that export. So to the extent that you are just interested in understanding trade flows, you miss nothing just by focusing on the formal sector and completely ignoring the small firms or the informal firms. But if you're interested in the more general question, how does trade affect the economy as a whole? So what's the process of adjustment? What are the spillover effects from exports or from trade or from imports of intermediates to the rest of the economy? Then I will argue it's important to take into account the informal sector. And one question in that context is, do the standard results we have in trade change if we take into account the informal sector? So what I'm going to talk about is going to speak to these issues. Again, to remind you, what is informality? You can define informality in terms of firms, and these are the firms that don't register with the tax authorities, so they're invisible to the government. And then you can also define informality in terms of workers. Informal workers are those not covered by labor regulations. So in our context, this work is going to focus on Brazil. These are the workers who don't have this card that allows them to work in the formal sector, so a card that represents the formal labor contract. And again, to remind you, why is informality so undesirable from the policymaker's point of view? So one reason is tax avoidance. Given that these firms are invisible to the government, they don't pay taxes. This is one of the reasons that policymakers try very hard to capture. To capture those firms, I argued yesterday that in this digital age, it is in principle possible to capture these firms. A second reason economists view those as potentially undesirable is in order to stay informal, a firm needs to stay small, so then they're associated with all size-dependent distortions and misallocation of resources. From the workers' point of view, a third reason is that informal jobs are considered to be less desirable. There is no insurance, no job security, no job stability. So these are all the negatives of informality. However, I argued yesterday that de facto informality also may provide more flexibility in settings where there is very strict labor market regulation, and especially when economies are hit with an adverse shock. Okay, so the approach that we developed in this paper in order to take into account all these issues is based on an equilibrium model, a general equilibrium model that in turn builds on some earlier work by Kossar, Gunner, and Taibaud. And its basic features, just to give you an overview of the model, are as follows. They are heterogeneous firms in the spirit of Mellitz. These firms have a choice between operating in the informal sector, in which case they don't face labor market regulation, they don't pay taxes, but they can be caught, and then they pay a penalty. Or they can work in the formal sector, in which case they pay taxes, they face all these regulations, but there are also some advantages, and I'll talk about this more later. There are certain matching frictions in the labor market. There is a rich institutional setting that includes minimum wages, hiring costs, firing costs, and also payroll and value-added taxes. And also we have import tariffs. This is going to be an open economy model. Taxes and labor market regulations are imperfectly enforced by the government. This is really important. This is what gives rise to informality. And then, as I emphasized before, given that we're interested in trade, specifically in this work, trade plays an important role in the model through two channels. First, there are imports, and imports are going to affect all firms in the economy through the aggregate demand channels and input-output links. But also we have exporters, again in the spirit of Mellitz, and these firms are going to play an important role when it comes to adjustments in trade costs. We estimate this model using several data sources from Brazil, and some of these sources I'm sure you have come across. So one is HAIS, which Gabriel talked about earlier. So these are the matched employer-employee data for Brazil. These are administrative data that capture all formal establishments and all formal workers. This has been used extensively in recent work. And then there are 4 more data sets that capture the formal sector. There is SESEX that has customs data, so this allows us to identify those firms that are exporters. And then there are 3 firm-level surveys, PIA, PAS, and PAC. So these firm-level surveys capture manufacturing, the retail sector, and the service sector, and they provide information on revenues and also inputs. And so these 5 data sets capture the formal sector in Brazil. We have a very comprehensive picture of the formal sector. However, they don't capture the informal sector. Now, the big advantage of Brazil, and this is one reason we focus on this country, is Brazil also has good data on the informal sector, and there we use 2 data sets. So one is a SINF, and that's again the data set that Gabriel talked about earlier today. So this is an informality survey that was conducted only 1 year, 2003. It's a cross-section of firms, but importantly, it captures small firms, firms that have up to 5 employees, and it captures both formal and informal establishments, and also they ask firms about their informal workers, what type of contract they have. And then there is also a household survey that is a rotating panel, the PME, that gives us work-level data, and we can use those data to trace transitions between jobs, between the formal and the informal sector. So we estimate this model using these data sets, and then we use it to perform various counterfactual simulations to understand the effects of trade in our case, but in principle you can also use it to understand the effects of other counterfactual policies. Now let me answer one question that always comes up in this context. To what extent can you trust this data? So again, by definition, informality refers to settings where at least some portion of the economic activity is unobservable to governments, and that's one reason we have little empirical work on informality, is we don't have much data on it. So there are good reasons to be concerned that we don't completely capture all informality that we see in the data. That said, given our estimates, the share of labor force in Brazil that's informal is quite high. It's around 50%. So if you think that our data leads us to underestimate the importance of informality, I would argue if the real share is higher, this is one more reason to study the phenomenon, because it's really a substantial share of labor in this economy. And second, the data in Brazil are considered to be quite good in terms of quality, and this is because Brazil has devoted a lot of effort to understanding informality, so the government gives guarantees that these data are not going to be used to audit firms or to prosecute firms that evade taxes and so on. So the general sentiment among people who have used them is that the data is quite informative about these issues. So needless to say, informality is a very complex phenomenon. And when you try to think about it, when you try to develop a framework about it, there are a myriad of modeling choices you can make. So let me start by presenting 5 facts based on this data that I just described that guide the theoretical model. And what I mean by guide is we try, when we develop the theoretical model, we try to match at least these 5 facts. We also match other facts, but these are the 5 ones that are important for the kind of mechanisms we exploit in our work, and so we take special care to generate a model that can generate them. So the first one, fact 1, is that Brazil has a large informal sector, as I said, about 48% of employment. And second, transitions from unemployment to the informal sector are more than twice as likely as transitions from unemployment to formal. So you can see this fact reflected in these numbers here. So if you look at the share of informal employment, this is 0.482. The transition rate from unemployment to informal employment here is 0.45, so more than twice as large as the transition rate to formal employment. So this is quite important. So what it means in practical terms is that if you become unemployed, it's going to be much easier to get a job in the informal sector than in the formal sector. So if you have a framework, if you have a model that is going to generate unemployment, this is also going to generate informality in our framework. Another thing that's interesting about Brazil, and you can see that in the top part of the panel, is that contrary to many people's prior that all informal employment is in the service sector, that's actually not true. There are also many people who are informally employed in the manufacturing sector. So that's fact one. Fact two, it may not come as a big surprise, is that the probability that the firm is informal declines sharply with its employment size. So larger firms are less likely to be informal. Obviously, when a firm is large, it's more visible to the government. Fact number three, informal firms are on average less productive than formal firms, and the words on average are important here. So as I showed you here, there is an overlap in the productivity distributions between formal and informal firms, but on average, informal firms are less productive. Fact number four, the average informal worker is paid lower wages than the average formal worker. Okay, and that's again something I mentioned yesterday. That's one reason informal jobs are considered to be less desirable than formal jobs. And fact number five, that's also important. I think fact five may be less well known. The other facts are perhaps not very surprising, but fact five, as I said, is not as known. Firm level labor turnover tends to decline with employment size, so large firms tend to be more stable. But conditional on employment size, exporters tend to be more volatile. You know? So this again is reflected in this table. So this table first regresses turnover to employment size. So this is this row here, and then an exporter dummy. And the turnover is defined in the Davis-Holtigonger way to include both growth and shrinkage of firms. If you regress turnover on employment size, you see that the coefficient is negative, so bigger firms tend to be more stable. But then conditional on employment size, as I said earlier, exporters are more volatile. Okay? And again, this is going to play an important role when I come to the way in which openness affects an economy, affects the economy, that affects informality. Now, let me give you a sketch of the model of the framework that we use. And this is a fairly technical framework. I will try to avoid getting too specific about equations and mathematical notation. But let me say something general about the approach towards modeling this problem. This is not a purely theoretical paper in the sense that we're trying to develop an elegant model to make one point. It's definitely not that. If you just wanted to make one point, let's say that informal firms are on average less productive, you could probably do that with a very simple model. It's also not a purely empirical paper in the sense that we're trying to just present some facts. Instead, methodologically, it's what people tend to call a quantitative paper, in the sense that we're trying to develop a theoretical framework. It's a model, so as such, it's always going to be an abstraction, but we try to make sure that it captures some important features of the data, so that we have at the end a model that we can actually confront with the data. Right? So we try to be as realistic as possible within the limits of feasibility. So that's the general approach. So with that in mind, Here are the main ingredients of this model. So we assume that the economy is populated by homogeneous, infinitely lived workers, consumers that receive utility from consuming two aggregate goods. There is a tradable good, that's C, and there is a non-tradable good, the service good, that's S. Okay? Each of these composite goods is itself an aggregate, a CS aggregate, consisting of N varieties, NC varieties for the tradable sector, and NS varieties for the non-tradable sector. Okay? So obviously this is a very rudimentary way of modeling demand. And as I will show you later, it's not completely innocuous. Let me highlight two assumptions that are going to be important in the counterfactuals. And some of them we can relax, some we cannot. So one is we allow the elasticities of substitution to be different in the tradable and the non-tradable sector, but we don't allow them to be different between formal and informal firms. And the reason is we cannot simply we cannot identify these parameters. Okay? So this is going to have implications when we actually do counterfactual simulations, because simply put, we don't allow goods that are produced in the informal sector to be more or less differentiated than goods in the formal sector. We don't allow them in this framework to be goods of that have lower quality or higher quality. We just treat them completely symmetrically. Okay? Another feature of this specification, so as anyone who has worked with this specification knows, is there is a built-in love of variety here. And that has pluses and minuses. So on one hand, I was having this conversation yesterday about people when we're talking about informality, that very often we associate, we derive utility out of consuming things that we consider to be inefficient. You go to a truck, on the street, it's a small firm. It's not informal in the UK, but it would be informal in a developing country. You pick up fruit or you pick up a coffee, and this is something that increases your utility. By most metrics that economists use, this is not really an efficient firm, but nevertheless, we derive utility out of this, and this in our framework, it would be captured through the variety effect. It adds to variety. Now, this is, to a certain extent, this is something positive, because we do want to take into account the fact that when you have more firms, formal or informal, you have more variety, so this adds to consumer utility. On the other hand, you may question whether the increase in utility that consumers derive is substantially enough to compensate for the loss of efficiency. So this is something to keep in mind when we come to the counterfactuals. Now, in each sector, tradable and non-tradable, the goods are produced by heterogeneous firms. This, again, is very much in the spirit of Melitz. And they're produced using labor, L, and intermediate inputs, I. Again, these are combined in a Cobb-Douglas fashion with constant returns to scale. Each of these intermediate goods, I, is itself an aggregate, a composite of intermediate goods in the tradable sector, IMC, and intermediate goods in the non-tradable sector, IMS. And again, each of these aggregates, each of these composites, it's a CS aggregate of tradable or non-tradable varieties. Okay, so this is a roundabout production structure. Intermediate inputs are going to be important in this framework because this is one way through which changes in trade, changes in openness are transmitted to the rest of the economy. The productivity process is assumed to follow an AR1 process that you see in the last line. And then this is going to be a dynamic framework. The reason we have a dynamic framework is because we are trying to match some facts that I referred to earlier, which are inherently dynamic, most importantly, these transition rates from unemployment to informality or formality. And the timing looks as follows. So consider first the incumbent firms. So a firm can be informal or formal. If it's an informal, it starts at the initial period with value function V. The value function is a function with two arguments. The first argument is Z, that's productivity, and the second argument is L, that's the employment size. Okay. So then this firm has three choices. It can stay informal, it can exit, or it can become formal. So depending, this firm draws a productivity, draws Z, and depending on this productivity draw, it can choose one of these three paths. Then, conditional on this decision, it chooses the labor for the next period. This is L prime. That generates profits, pi, K. K is always the sector, and I is the informal firm. These are a function of three arguments: Z, the productivity draw; L, the employment size; and also the L prime, so the labor, the employment size of the next period. The reason both enter is because we have hiring and firing costs. And then in the next period, there is a new draw, Z prime, and then the firm enters the firm starts the next period with a new value function. If the firm is formal, then it faces a very similar problem with one difference. As you can see, there are two choices that we consider. It can stay formal or it can exit. And so we don't allow for this formal firm to become informal. Why do we do this? So one reason is computational. It would make the model even more complicated, but another reason is really substantive, and it is that if a firm is formal, if it's visible to the government, it would be very odd to become informal all of a sudden, to disappear. What we do allow in this framework is if a firm has a negative, has a bad productivity draw, then it exits completely, and then it can enter the next period as an informal firm. So there is a way to go from formal to informal, but the firm has to exit first. So this is the structure. Regarding entry, so this goes for the incumbents. Regarding entry, there is a mass, MK, of entrants into sector K. Again, to remind you, sector K can be tradables or non-tradables. In order to enter, they need to pay an entry cost, that's C. And then once they pay this cost, they draw the Z from an ergodic distribution. We assume free entry, and then you can see on this slide, you can see what the structure of what the timing structure of entry is. So the entrant pays this entry cost, draws the productivity, draws Z, and depending on this draw, it can enter the informal sector. It can choose to exit the market completely, or it can enter the formal sector. And we assume that these firms enter with employment size 1. So you enter with just one employee, that's yourself, and then in the next period, you can choose to stay one, to remain just by yourself, or you can increase your employment size and pick L prime. Okay, so that's the structure. Now let me come to the profit functions, and this is where all the action is. That's where the differences between formal and informal firms are visible. So the top line shows you the profit function of formal firms. And this profit function is a function of three arguments: productivity, Z, current employment size, L, and future employment size, L prime. So what's the profit? What are the profits of a formal firm? So there are value added. Perfect. There are the value added of this firm operating in sector K. Now, because this firm is formal, it has to pay value-added taxes. This is this tau here. These are taxes that the firm pays. And then these are the fixed costs. These are the costs, the variable costs of operation, and this is the fixed cost. Now, what are the variable costs of operation if you are a formal firm? So whatever you see here in red denotes things that are different between formal and informal firms. So first, there are labor costs, the wage bill of the current labor force. So the wage that formal firms pay is going to be the maximum between a wage that's determined on the market and the minimum wage. So the W lower bar denotes the minimum wage. If the minimum wage is binding, then formal firms are obliged to pay the minimum wage, okay, times the labor force. And then, because these firms are formal, they also have to pay payroll taxes. Okay, so in the wage bill, these are the two ways, the two particular constraints, if you want, that formal firms face. They face the minimum wage, and they have to pay payroll taxes. Then if this firm is expanding, if it hires in the next period more workers, then it's going to face hiring costs, and I will come in a moment to those. On the other hand, if this firm is shrinking, if it decides to reduce its labor force, so that means the labor next period is lower than the labor today, then this firm is going to face firing costs. So this is this K here. Again, one difference between formal and informal firms is that formal firms in Brazil face this firing cost. This is K here. So again, you know, to recap, the red, all the parts in red here denote the ways in which formal firms face additional burden, additional regulations. These are the value-added taxes, the payroll taxes, minimum wages, and firing costs, which are very substantial in Brazil. Okay. Now, if you are an informal firm, the profit function looks slightly different. So first, you don't pay value-added taxes. Okay, so that's the top line here. You have, again, variable costs and fixed costs. However, you do face a cost of informality. This is this K here. It denotes the cost of informality, and we make this dependent on size. So why is that? So this can be a literal penalty that firms have to pay if they get caught. So in the worst case, they can be shut down, so they lose their entire revenue, or they can pay a fine. Or you can think of this as reflecting the opportunity cost associated with being informal. So for example, these firms don't have access to formal finance. They cannot export. In order to export, you have to be registered in Brazil. So there's also a cost to being informal. And this is reflected in this part here. However, when it comes to the variable cost, you can see that nothing here is red anymore. There are no payroll taxes, and there are no firing costs. There are hiring costs as before. But importantly, by being informal, firms they're not subject to all these regulations that are actually burdensome in Brazil. It's not just the payroll taxes. More importantly, here are the firing costs. So, so this is the structure of the profits. So given the functional forms, form assumptions we have made, and monopolistic competition, and the fact that we have intermediate inputs, you can apply the CS algebra, and then you get some complicated expressions that you can find in the paper that eventually boil down to the following. The value added of a firm operating in sector K is going to take this form. There's going to be here a demand shifter psi, and this demand shifter, it's going to depend on price indices, the aggregate price index of the tradable sector, and also the price index of the non-tradable sector, and it's also going to depend on aggregate income. And the reason I'm explicit about this here is because all this is going to be affected by trade. Sure. Yeah, so we assume that it's the same. I think so. Gabriel probably knows more about that, but yes, he's there. Right. So here we don't allow for any differences across firms. That's just we assume that they're the same. So before I introduce hiring costs. So let me briefly show you what the hiring cost function looks in our framework. So the cost of expanding from L to L prime workers takes this form, which is not going to mean much to you, but let me just highlight two things. So this mu here is an endogenous object, is the probability of filling a vacancy in sector K and firm type J. Then the rest here, or the other letters here, denote parameters that we estimate. Among these parameters, there are two that are really important. There is this gamma 1 here and this gamma 2. And the reason these parameters are important is depending on, we don't impose them, we actually estimate them, but depending on their values, it's possible to generate two features that are important in the data. One is that the firm level turnover declines with firm size. This is really important. You know, if you remember, I showed you before fact 5, as firms become larger, they are more stable. This is going to be important when I come to mechanisms. So depending on these values, you can actually generate that. And second, depending again on these parameters, and especially the gamma 1, you can also generate wage dispersion across firms. And again, generating wage dispersion is important if you want to study inequality, which is one of the things that we do study in this framework. And just to give you a brief, a very rough intuition of why that's the case. So in this framework, the wage that firms pay is going to be proportional to the value added per worker, which is, by virtue of the CES, proportional to the marginal value added per worker. So firms are going to set the marginal value of worker equal to the marginal cost. If there were no convexity, so the gamma 1 is the parameter that governs the convexity of the hiring cost function. So without convexity, you have a linear marginal cost. So the marginal cost of the additional worker is the same across all firms. And that would imply that all firms would pay exactly the same wages. So you would have no wage dispersion. If there is convexity, and again, we don't impose that, but in the end, we estimate a parameter that implies convexity. If there is convexity, then it means that a firm that grows faces a higher marginal cost. And therefore, as you grow, the marginal cost increases. So with firms that are growing, have to pay higher wages. Okay, so that's one of the channels that generate wage dispersion. And in addition, depending on given the structure of this model, we can also generate another feature that's important in most data sets, namely the exporter wage premium, so exporters pay higher wages. There is search and matching in this model. So we assume that workers are matched to firms and vacancies randomly. So it's a model with random matching. And once they're matched, wages are determined by Nash bargaining. So there are search frictions in this labor market, and that means that informal or unproductive firms are able to keep workers at lower wages as long as these wages are above reservation prices. If firms want to expand from L to L prime, then they post vacancies, as I said. We assume that the firm vacancies and the number of unemployed workers determine the number of matches that occur through the matching function. This is the matching function in the economy. Okay, so it depends on the number of workers who are unemployed and also on the number of vacancies in each of these sectors. So again, to remind you of notation here, C and S refer to the two sectors, and F and I refer to formal and informal firms. Just jumping ahead, these parameters here, the phi and the xi, so these are parameters that we cannot really identify in the data, so we rely on the previous literature to set their values. And finally, we assume that these matches in each sector are proportional to the relative number of vacancies firms post. That all would apply to a closed economy. Now let me come to the part that refers to the open economy. This is a small open economy economy model, which seems appropriate for Brazil, meaning that the aggregate conditions abroad are fixed and also the set of imported goods is fixed. Okay? Manufacturing sector firms choose how much to export given foreign demand. In order to export, you need to pay a fixed cost to export, and the export decision is, again, described by a standard Mellitz model. There is a fixed cost of exporting, and firms are going to export if their value added net of this fixed cost of exporting is higher than the value added that they would face as domestic firms. Yeah.
Just one question related to the labor market in this context. So from the point of view of the worker, the difference between a formal and informal firm is just a difference in pay, right? Or is there anything else like a
That's a very good point. So yes, it's only the wage. Ideally, you would like to have a framework that captures also this other value of informality, if you want, or formality rather than you have job security. You do have the benefits, right? So the benefits do enter the calculation. But what we don't have explicitly here is the value of job security, of job stability, of having unemployment insurance. And in general, this is not a model that has risk aversion. So that part is not incorporated in the model, and I don't think it would be feasible to do that. So we would very much like to be able to extend the work in that direction, but I don't think this is something that's feasible. On the other hand, the one thing that we can capture is this value of informality as being an employment buffer. So this is something that we can actually generate here, and I will talk about this later. But this particular benefit in terms of job security, this is not here. Okay, so again, if you work through the algebra, just very briefly, to remind you, that's the expression we had for the value add of domestic firms. For the exporters, you get a similar expression, except there is this red term in front, which you can show is greater than 1. And this is going to be important because it suggests that for exporters, there is a magnification effect. It's this part here that generates the higher volatility that exporters face. So any particular productivity shock that firms face is going to generate more volatility for exporters than it creates for domestic firms. And you can get a sense of where I'm going with this. When an open economy is exposed to shocks, exporters are going to be more volatile. Finally, just to close the model, the equilibrium conditions are stated here. So firms act optimally. They make entry-exit decisions, and they post vacancies. There is free entry. The wages solve the bargaining problem between workers and the firm. Labor markets clear. Good markets clear. And finally, importantly, we focus on a steady state. That means we assume that the distribution of firms, the number of firms, the number of workers in each sector are stable. And again, given the nature of the questions that we are trying to address, ideally one day we would like to be able to explore transitional dynamics. We are not at this point yet, so we start with a steady state model. And consistent with that, when the data we use are based on 1 year only, 2003. So our basic assumption is that Brazil is in the steady state in 2003. Again, this is dictated by data, but I think it's also not a horrible assumption because in 2003, things were as stable as one can hope for, given the volatility that Brazil and the global economy face. So now let me come to, yeah. Yeah.
That's accumulated benefits. I'm just thinking about it aloud.
So that's a good point. We don't have the benefits explicitly down. Now the workers understand the model and they optimize accordingly. And there are the firing costs there. So the firing costs, again, Gabrielle knows more the details, but my understanding is that the firing costs, so firms pay something to the state, but they also pay the workers directly, right? So again, this is something we don't completely model this split. But again, the main assumption is that workers fully understand the setup and they understand that they're going to benefit from the existence of the firing costs. So I think that's the extent to which that enters directly the calculation. But beyond that, the fact is we don't have these benefits explicitly.
I was thinking actually it's probably fair to say that many of these additional benefits that are not wage per se are probably highly correlated with the wage, and in some sense from modeling perspectives maybe isomorphic. So it's worth just thinking of which of these benefits to the workers or cost to the firm could be mapped to a variable cost or a fixed cost. And as long as we have that mapping, that it may be isomorphic to what we're reviewing.
So you're saying there could be also a compensating differential.
Yeah.
So you pay wage, yeah. Yes, you can think about it this way. Okay, so let me talk a little bit now about the mechanisms that are operating in this model. And again, as I said earlier, so this is not a paper that yields a clear prediction, so this is going to happen as you open up to trade or as you remove one particular regulation. So there are several, as I'm going to show you, there are several things going on at the same time. And ultimately, it's going to be an empirical question which of these effects is going to dominate. So actually, we view that as a plus of this framework, that in the end, there is some empirical content in the exercise, given that the model itself doesn't have unambiguous predictions about what the effects are going to be. So let me be more explicit about what the mechanisms are. So first, there are what we call Melitz type effects. So if you open up this economy to trade, so if you reduce trade costs, the various thresholds, the productivity thresholds move. And so let me also correct myself here briefly. I'm going to talk in the following about productivity thresholds. This is not exactly correct because the value function of these firms depends both on productivity and employment size. So to give intuition, I'm going to talk as if the value functions depended only on productivity. This is not entirely accurate, but I think it's still going to be good enough to convey some intuition. So in our framework, and again, I didn't go through all the algebra, we have two types of trade frictions. One is we have iceberg trade cost. This is this tau A, and the other one is tariffs, traditional tariffs. This is tau C. So let's say you reduce this tariff, these trade frictions. What happens in this economy? So on one hand, the demand for purely domestic firms goes down. This is a negative demand shock. But at the same time, the demand for exporters goes up, right? So you open up export markets, foreign markets to exporters. So what this implies is that the least productive formal firms may exit and eventually get replaced by informal firms. So that would lead to an increase in informality. And so that would correspond to this view that I talked about yesterday, that openness may ultimately lead to a race to the bottom, right? You open up, domestic firms face more competition, and in order to stay competitive, they have to become informal. So that would be this. That would be this effect. On the other hand, there is also another effect. So the least productive informal firms exit; they fall below the threshold, and that would lead to a decrease in informality. And this is the effect that the structural transformation literature emphasizes. So, for example, the McCaig and Pouchnick paper, right? So when you open up an economy to trade, then the increased competition weeds out the less productive informal firms. So again, which of the two effects is going to dominate in the data is ultimately an empirical question. So that's one effect. Another effect works through the intermediates. So when you open up to trade, the price of intermediates goes down, and as a result, worker productivity goes up. And again, this can have ambiguous effects on informality. So on one hand, the most productive informal firms may grow and formalize, and that will lead to a decrease in informality. And then at the same time, all this generates higher income and demand. And given that, there may be entry of low productivity informal firms, and that would lead to an increase in informality. So all these effects go in very different directions, and that's why I said before, I started with a caveat. This model is not going to yield unambiguous theoretical predictions. So again, if you have a taste for elegant theoretical models, this is not what this is. Everything is messy, and ultimately it's going to come down to what the parameters are going to imply. So this is one type of mechanism, and this operates all through thresholds. And again, just to remind you, we have many thresholds here. There is a threshold for entry. There is a threshold for formalization, so 2. And then we have these thresholds both for firms in manufacturing and for firms in the non-tradable sector, right? So there are 4 thresholds here that are relevant. Then, so that's one set of mechanisms. So this mechanism you can also get in a static model. You wouldn't need a dynamic model for that. But then there are also there is also the dynamic mechanism. And this is the channel that links trade to unemployment. So if trade leads to higher unemployment, given that the transitions from unemployment to informality are substantially higher, twice as large as the transitions from unemployment to formality, if we have more unemployment, then we are also going to have more informality, right? And so it turns out that the turnover at exporters is larger. So again, remember there was that was a fact in the data, that conditional on size, exporters are more volatile. They have higher turnover. So when trade barriers go down, when the economy opens up, resources get reallocated towards exporters. Exporters are bigger firms, so that's going to have stabilization effects because bigger firms have lower turnover, but at the same time, conditional on size, exporters are more volatile. So that is going to lead to more volatility. So whether or not in the end, the higher volatility, the lower volatility of firms of bigger size versus the higher volatility of exporters is going to dominate is going to be an empirical question. If, as a result of trade, we have more volatility in the end and more unemployment, this is also going to lead to more informality in this framework. So this is the dynamic channel. Okay. So we use indirect inference.
Quick clarification.
Yeah.
Where is that higher volatility for exporters coming from? Is it the productivity shock driving it, or is it the demand?
It's, if you remember when I showed you the value added of exporters,
Equation, but I don't know where it's coming from. So.
it's coming, there is this magnification effect. So the revenues of exporters are much larger than the revenues of domestic firms. So take the value added that you had as a domestic exporter, and then you multiply, there is a multiplier effect. So that means if you hit a firm with a productivity shock for an exporter, this would be magnified. That's the idea. So now let me show you, so these are the mechanisms. So now let me show you, given, we estimate this model using indirect inference. So some of the parameters are not identified, and we set them to values we take from the literature. Some of the values are statutory values taken based on the study of the regulation in Brazil. And then there are 27 parameters that we use, that we estimate using 84 data moments and auxiliary model coefficients. I won't talk about fit, etc. This is all in the paper. In general, the fit is pretty good. We match the 5 facts we wanted to match quite good. We also match moments that we didn't target pretty well. There are a couple of things we don't match, but this is a topic for another day. Let me come now to the mechanisms that are the focus of this work. Namely, first of all, how does trade affect informality? So the first question is, can this model generate these facts we observe in the data, namely that when you open up to trade, informality doesn't necessarily go up or down? So what happens in this framework? So let me try to explain these graphs a little bit. So tariffs in Brazil in 2003 were very low. They were about 12%. And therefore, you don't get much traction of tariffs. So we do all the counterfactuals in terms of iceberg trade cost. This is this tau C here. So the baseline value we start with is 2.5. And this is based on previous work This is based on mainly on the Eaton and Kortum model, but also other work. So that's the baseline value. Then, if you increase the trade costs, if you set them to a value equal to 6, this generates something close to autarky. You shut down trade. If you reduce them to 1.5, then you have a very dramatic reduction of trade costs. This is a 40% reduction of trade costs, which is very large, but not unheard of. This is basically what happened in East Asia. Okay, so this gives you some idea of what the range is. So first, we consider how would informality be affected in the tradable sector, so in the manufacturing sector, if you reduce the trade costs. And what you can see very clearly in the first graph here is that a decrease in trade costs reduces informality quite dramatically. An increase in trade costs increases informality. This has been one of the most robust results in the paper. Again, opening up to trade reduces informality in the tradable sector. So this is very much consistent with what Pauchnik and McCaig found for Vietnam. This is exactly the Vietnam story. You open up to trade, and in the manufacturing sector, informality goes down, right? And essentially, the interpretation is here in terms of the thresholds I talked about. So what happens is, as you open up to trade, many low productivity informal firms get out of the market. So this effect dominates. That's the interpretation here. On the other hand, if you look at what happens in the non-tradable sector, you see the opposite effect. So in this case, you have an increase in informality as you reduce the trade costs. If you reduce them further, informality goes slightly down, but overall, relative to the baseline scenario, informality increases. The interpretation is, as you open up to trade, incomes increase, aggregate demand increase, and that makes low productivity informal firms profitable. So you have entry of low productivity informal firms in the service sector. Now, if you put the two together, so what happens in the tradable, in the non-tradable sector, then in the end you get what happens in this graph here, in the third graph, namely that you can't make a clear prediction as to what happens to informality as you open up the economy to trade. So in the tradable sector, informality goes down, but in the non-tradable sector, informality goes up. And so in the aggregate, informality may go up and down depending on the magnitude of the trade liberalization. And so we think these graphs, these patterns are interesting because to a certain extent they replicate exactly these patterns that I talked about before that you see in the aggregate data, namely that on one hand we have this evidence that in countries like Vietnam, opening up to trade leads to a decrease in informality in the manufacturing sector. On the other hand, when you look at the aggregate data across the world, you don't see that in the aggregate informality has been affected at all, even though economies have become much more open. And our interpretation is that even though informality may be going down in the tradable sector, the service sector is still dominated by informal firms. And in fact, informality increases in this sector. What about unemployment and welfare? So we have unemployment in this model. Here again, it's interesting what happens. So if you reduce trade costs, again here you reduce them dramatically, the unemployment rate goes up quite a bit. And the reason this happens, this is entirely driven by the higher volatility of exporters. So resources are allocated towards exporters. Exporters are large firms. Large firms are more stable, but again, exporters are much more volatile. And you cannot see that in this graph, but one reason you can see that this is driven all by exporters is the increase in the unemployment rate is driven by the tradable sector, by the manufacturing sector. In the non-tradable sector, the large firms have this stabilization effect. So large firms in the non-tradable sector are more stable. So they dampen this effect on the unemployment rate. Now, despite the increase in the unemployment rate, if you look at real incomes and what happens in real incomes go up. And then the measure of welfare we use in this paper is real income minus the disutility of unemployment. I don't always show you the welfare measure that we use because in most cases it looks exactly like the real income, even though unemployment goes dramatically up here. Our welfare measure, namely real income minus the disutility of unemployment, still go up in this case. So in short, in this case, even though trade leads to an increase in unemployment, there is still a welfare increase associated with trade. And the reason you get that is because of what happens to aggregate TFP. So if you trace what happens to aggregate TFP by sector, there's some interesting patterns here. So on one hand, you replicate the well-known finding that as you open up an economy to trade, resources get allocated towards larger, more productive firms, so productivity goes up. Okay, so this would be reflected in this blue line here that represents the formal sector. So according to our estimates, if you have a 40% reduction of trade costs, productivity would go up by 11%. However, the increase, if you take into account the informal sector, the increase in productivity is substantially larger. So you get an increase of 31%. And the reason here is, again, this effect on informal and low productivity informal firms in the manufacturing sector that are driven out of the market. So if you take both sectors into account, the productivity effects of trade are estimated to be much larger. Interestingly, in the service sector, you find exactly the opposite. And again, this is very much consistent with the previous findings. What you see in the service sector is there is entry of low productivity service firms, informal firms, and these firms are going to drive the overall productivity down. So there is still a productivity increase, but it's not as pronounced as when you focus on formal service firms alone. So if you put the two together, you still find an increase in productivity, and in the end, the aggregate increase in productivity, if you take into account informality, is larger than the increase you would get without informality. So at the beginning, I asked this question, so what happens, how are the predictions of standard trade models affected if we take informality into account? And one of the differences is that the productivity effects of trade are actually larger if you take the informal sector into account. And this is despite the fact that you see entry of informal firms in the service sector. Another question you can look at that's quite interesting is how inequality is affected by trade. And so we look here at the standard deviation of log wages across workers in the manufacturing sector, in the service sector. And let me say one thing about inequality here. Inequality here is defined in a very particular way that I think labor economists are going to object to, and namely, inequality is driven completely by inequality across firms. Because workers are homogeneous. They don't differ in characteristics, right? And this is one of the limitations of this framework. So workers in the formal sector are the same, have the same quality, the same skills as workers in the informal sector here, so we don't allow for worker heterogeneity. So when I talk about inequality here, it refers entirely to one dimension of inequality, which is inequality across firms. Now, to our defense, this is the dimension that many trade papers have focused on, right? Because many trade papers have focused on firm heterogeneity. So for example, all the work of Helpman and co-authors has focused on heterogeneity driven by heterogeneity across firms. So the results here are quite interesting because if you look at what happens at the formal sector, then what you find is that the wage inequality in the formal sector increases. And again, what drives that is the fact that exporters pay higher wages. So as you allocate more resources towards exporters, inequality increases. So that replicates the well-known finding in the literature, so it's very much consistent with results in Kosar or Helpman et al. That show that when you open up to trade, inequality increases. However, if you take into account the informal sector, then the opposite happens. You find that inequality decreases in the informal sector, and then if you put the two together, so the formal and the informal sector in the tradable sector, in the manufacturing sector, actually you find a quite substantial decrease in inequality. Now, these numbers are not very easy to interpret because what happens is this inequality number at the end, this inequality figure depends on inequality within formal tradables, inequality within informal tradables, and then the distance between the two. And they're all affected at the same time, and they're affected because all the thresholds move. So you have, again, you have entry of higher productivity formal firms, but you have also exit of lower productivity informal firms. So this changes completely the firm size distribution. But the bottom line is that incorporating here the informal sector leads to very different conclusions compared to the ones you would get if you didn't incorporate the informal sector. That's also true if you look at the service sector. Again, in the service sector, you get a decrease in the standard deviation of log wages across workers employed in different firms. And that's, again, in contrast to what people often find. Then, so far, to recap, is accounting for informality allows us to reproduce many of the findings that have been reported in the literature, but there are also some conclusions that differ from previous ones. One of them regards the effect of trade on productivity, so you get a higher effect of trade on productivity. You also get the opposite result from that document in the previous work when it comes to inequality, namely trade liberalization reduces inequality. Then we ask another question. So trade liberalization is one possible policy you can consider in this framework, but in principle you can consider many different policies. One of them is stricter enforcement. So these are the issues that Gabriel talked about before. So there are two, when you talk about stricter enforcement, you can think of two cases. One is you try to wipe out informal firms completely. So you make the cost of operating very high and you shut them down. Or you can, what this graph shows is it plots the penalty functions, and you can try to make the penalty functions steeper. So what I mean by that is the following. We estimate these penalty functions separately for the tradable and the non-tradable sector. So the solid lines here show you the benchmark, so our estimates. And as you would expect, the penalty of being informal increases with employment size. Right? So in one of the experiments that we conducted, one of the counterfactuals, we make the slope of this penalty function steeper. So it becomes more expensive to be informal as you grow. And one implication of this particular policy we consider is firms cannot be informal if they have more than 5 employees. So at the size of 5, you have to become informal or you have to exit the market. So one question you can ask then is how would this economy be affected in these scenarios? And here the results I think are quite interesting. So this table shows you 3 scenarios. So one is the benchmark case. That's the first column. The second one is what would happen if you made the penalty function steeper, so that's stricter enforcement. And the third case is what would happen if the enforcement is so strict that you wipe out informality completely. Okay, so that can give you some sense of the value of informality if you want. And so first, let's look at the unemployment rate. So the baseline unemployment rate is 18%. So if you have no informality, as you would expect, an unemployment rate goes way up. It becomes 32.6%. Okay, this is what you would expect. All these workers that used to be employed in the informal sector become unemployed. Okay. But then let's see what happens to productivity and welfare. So we normalize everything in the benchmark case to be 1, so that comparisons are easy. So the first thing to note, if you compare the case of no informality, that's the strictest case, to the benchmark case, the first thing that happens is TFP increases quite dramatically. So it increases by almost 32% in the tradable sector and almost 40% in the service sector. So this is what policymakers have in mind when they try to curb informality. This is this huge boost in aggregate productivity, right? Now, again, to remind you, 31% is exactly what you get if you if you have a reduction of trade costs by 40%. So if you compare this case where you have no informalities to strict enforcement where you wipe out informal firms to a case where you simply liberalize by reducing trade costs, you get exactly the same productivity boost, namely 31%. Okay. But then see what happens here at the very end, the last two rows, to real income and real income 2. Real income 2 refers to our welfare measure. To remind you, this is real income minus the disutility of unemployment. So in the case of no informality, you have a quite dramatic reduction in welfare, in real income, and also welfare. And this comes partly from unemployment. So the last row here comes from unemployment because our measure of welfare includes the disutility of unemployment. So the fact that the no informality scenario creates this big unemployment rate is going to be captured by the welfare function. But then there is also something else going on because the real income does not depend on the disutility of unemployment. The other thing that happens here, and that's why I said at the beginning that the CAs here, it's not completely innocuous. As you shut down informal firms, you shut down varieties. You eliminate varieties. And in this framework where there is love of variety, that creates also a welfare loss. I think it's important for these frameworks to capture that to a certain extent because people think of informal firms as being just inefficient parasites. But the fact is that also many informal, very small informal firms add to the utility of consumers. And so to a certain extent we capture that. But on the other hand, you may worry that perhaps the way we set this up, we bias our results towards placing too much value on informality from that point of view because again, the variety effect is as important for informal firms as it is for formal firms. So one way to address that perhaps is to allow for different elasticities of substitution for informal firms. But again, the main takeaway from that, so by the way, this didn't start as a trade paper, as I've said before. It didn't start as a paper that was trying to make the case for trade. We simply wanted to study informality and how the various predictions of trade models would be affected by the presence of informality. But then in the end, you come away with a very strong conviction that trade has enormous benefits. And one benefit that I think is very clear from this table, and I think it's also quite robust to what we do, is that with trade you get this big benefit on productivity, this big boost on productivity, without taking a hit on welfare. And you do generate some unemployment, but not as high an unemployment as you would get in the case of stricter enforcement. And at the same time, you reduce inequality, at least this particular dimension of inequality I talked about. So finally, let me, yeah.
Just one quick question. So in the way the model is set up, if you go to the other extreme and you allow all firms to be informal, then the welfare gain will be much larger. Is that correct? Because
All firms to be informal.
yeah, no taxes, for instance.
Just deregulate, the way of putting it is deregulate.
Exactly. Deregulation, so if making it stricter decreases welfare with respect to the benchmark, then the opposite would be like deregulating will increase welfare. Is that correct?
I'm not sure because productivity would go down dramatically in that case.
But
So
you
there
say
would be more variety. There would be much more variety. So that effect would be big. There would be no unemployment. So these effects, you are right, they would increase welfare substantially. But then there is the TFP effect, and so it's not quite clear to me where it would go.
Actually, to put it differently, is there a good sense in the model whether turnover is good and whether informal employment is actually welfare enhancing in some sense?
So let me come to this because so that's the final graph, which in my view is perhaps the most interesting, and it may come to this, it may actually answer this question. So the final counterfactual we consider is something that actually motivated this whole analysis. So we want to get at this question, so is actually informality a buffer? So not just an employment buffer, but also a welfare buffer. So the final thing we do is we hit the system with a negative productivity shock. And then we consider what would happen in 3 scenarios. One is the benchmark scenario, what we have in the data. So that's the blue line here. The second is the case where you have stricter enforcement, but some informality, that's the red line. And the final case is where you have no informality. So you have wiped out informality, that's the black line. Okay? So let me show you what happens. Some of it is expected. So the share of informal employment in the benchmark case, so you have this negative productivity shock. You know, in the benchmark case with informality, informal employment goes up. You know, actually, the unemployment rate, that's the second. The unemployment rate goes down, and this is because the informal sector here absorbs all the displaced workers. If you didn't have, if you didn't have an informal sector at all, that would be the black line. Obviously, the unemployment rate would shoot up. It would be much higher. And if you had stricter enforcement, then the informal sector can absorb some workers, but not as many as in the benchmark case. So again, you get an increase in the unemployment rate. So these parts are to be expected. But then see what happens to real incomes and welfare. So that to me is quite interesting. So in the case, in the benchmark case, where you have some informality, welfare goes down by more than in the case where you have stricter enforcement. So, and the case where you wipe out informality is somewhere in between. So what drives that? So on one hand, you know, in all this, you have lost income. So people become unemployed. So it's the unemployment rate that drives this. So real incomes are going to go down. But what is surprising is the ranking of the 3 lines. So actually, the welfare decrease is larger when, in the benchmark case, when you allow for informality. So why is that? So the next graph tells the story. So it's what happens to aggregate TFP. So in the benchmark case, where you have informality, the aggregate TFP in the manufacturing sector goes down, actually both in the tradable sector and in the non-tradable sector, it goes down quite dramatically. In the extreme case where you don't have no informality at all, so that's the black line, so in that case, actually TFP goes up. So you have this negative shock, but this is really the creative destruction type of explanation that you get massive exit of unproductive firms. Firms cannot become informal because you don't allow for informality, and as a result, productivity increases in this economy. And then, you know, the red case is somewhere in between. So still, this is a negative productivity shock. The economy is hit with a negative shock. So as a result, you still have, a negative welfare effect, but this negative welfare effect is not as pronounced as in the case where you do allow for informality. So that's why I'm not quite sure, as I said before, I'm not quite sure that that this TFP effect doesn't actually play a role in the end. So what we conclude from all this is that in the end, the results suggest that the informal sector does play this role of being an employment buffer. So if an economy is hit with a negative shock, and you can think of all these trade liberalization episodes, these local shocks as being local negative demand shocks, then the informal sector plays this role of a buffer, but it's not a welfare buffer. So it's an employment buffer, but not necessarily a welfare buffer. So just to conclude, so in the end, what we conclude from that is that modeling the informal sector is actually quite important, and not just the informal sector, also the non-tradable sector, because some important adjustments happen in the non-tradable sector. I think one nice thing about this model, you know, with all these limitations, is that it can replicate some of the patterns you see in diff and diff, some of the facts that people have generated with diff and diff research designs. So most importantly, it can explain why trade openness leads to declines in informality in the tradable sector. So this is, again, what McCaig and Pauchnik report, and this paper I talked about yesterday, so this new paper by Bachas, Post, Jensen, and Zachman, that shows that the effective tax rates on capital have increased in developing countries. It makes the same point that what happens in many developing countries is they opened up to trade, and economic activity in the tradable sector has been concentrated in formal establishments, and that allows governments to tax these establishments more easily. So our model can generate that. At the same time, it also can generate this aggregate fact that, that if you look at the economy as a whole, including the non-tradable sector, you don't see a decline in informality. Again, we do find that the informal sector acts as an employment buffer, but not necessarily as a welfare buffer. Again, you cannot help but coming away with a strong conviction that trade is preferable to other ways of curbing informality. So in this particular case, if you want to increase productivity, it's trade liberalization is a superior way to doing that compared to stricter enforcement, simply because it generates the same productivity gains. In our framework, actually, the productivity gains are of the same magnitude, but without these huge welfare losses that you see in the case of stricter enforcement. We do find that the effect of trade on productivity is actually understated if you leave the formal sector out. So this is one more reason that it's important to incorporate the informal sector. And last but not least, you can consider various scenarios, various magnitudes of trade liberalization, various interactions of trade liberalization with other policies. And one of the most robust findings is that trade always generates welfare gains. So actually, one of the reasons we started on this project is to examine this prediction that trade generates welfare gains. Is this still true if you have informality? And our answer is yes, it's actually true, and it's one of the findings that seems to be extremely robust. Finally, let me conclude with one note that's perhaps of more general interest than to people who are interested in trade only. So in principle, in this framework, you can allow for many different counterfactuals that correspond to different policies. So it's a stylized model, and you pointed out many things that are missing, for example, health benefits, other benefits that workers have. But on the other hand, we do have minimum wages, we do have taxes, we do have firing costs. So in principle, you could examine what would happen if you relaxed some of these regulations, if you reduced taxes, or if you increased minimum wages, or if you reduced firing costs. And many people would say that's perhaps a better way to curb informality. Rather than having stricter enforcement, you try to remove excessive regulation. And I think this is definitely worth pursuing. For this particular paper, for this particular project, our approach was, rather than looking at these particular measures, at these particular policies, rather than looking at the informal sector as a whole. So looking at the institution of informality in developing countries, modeling this institution as being the endogenous outcome of all these regulations, and then asking the question, given this particular institution, how do the predictions regarding the effect of openness are affected? So this was the approach in this paper, but in principle, I think you can use this framework to address all these other questions that come up. How do minimum wages, how do firing costs affect these economies? And I will stop here, and thank you again very much for your attention.